Thanks as always for accepting my work. The middle white. If she were on the farm, she'd be a two-toed ungulate, a middle white pig, as pink and soft-looking as a marshmallow, swollen and healthy and primed to drop a litter of piglets. 3 weeks now since he had completed the construction of the compound. Gideon Gilligan didn't like to spend too much time in any of the towns he had been exploring. Sometimes he just drove through without stopping. Otherwise he parked his Pajero on the outskirts and walked to its centre, his fixed gaze before him, seemingly unaware or disinterested in everything about him. But his reason for being there was as purposeful as the marauding lions moving across the Serengeti. Through his peripheral vision, he homed in on those with potential. With an expert eye for healthy livestock, he measured their potential at a glance, sturdy-boned, with rolls of flesh about their limbs, their haunches wide, good teeth, and a healthy shine to the eye were the qualities that he sought. There were a number of females who displayed these physical attributes, but they lacked one other particular necessity to complete Gilligan's ideal. Never a man to settle for less than his expectations, he held out until she presented herself. Ready to quit the hunt and return home querulous the day she finally showed up, his focus had switched to other things. The autumn evening had turned chilly, and he was without his jacket. He felt the cold burrowing under his shirt at the neck. He couldn't afford to be sick, not ever. Should anyone other than him be required to tend the livestock, all his plans would come undone. "Fuck this shit anyway," he said aloud, hawked up something bitter from his throat and spat into the pavement. He glanced quickly about him. His lapse, luckily, had drawn no unwanted attention. That's when the thing that slept in a nest at the backs of his eyes awoke. He twisted his wrist to look at his watch. Almost 5 o'clock. The Angelus bells would be chiming before the evening news by the time he got home. Another afternoon wasted. The furry thing with sharp teeth began to gnaw at the tissue attached to his skull. The cows would already be gathered at the gate, lowing to be milked. Inside his head, the trapped rat chewed with greater desperation. The flesh shavings, sliced off by sharp teeth, slipped down his throat and into his stomach, where they turned sour and festered. And then he saw her. Coming out from a Tesco Express store, a chubby girl with thick hair the colour of a fox's coat. About her shoulders a white jacket, which she held at the throat like a cape. Her other hand rested on her swollen stomach. Weeks only, maybe days before she was due to give birth. But she wasn't alone. Walking beside her, a nondescript, dowdy girl who looked like a million other girls. Gilligan feigned checking his mobile, put it on silent, and, with the phone pressed to his ear, crossed the road and followed the two women at a respectable distance. A light rain began to fall. He spoke in a low voice to nobody at the end of the line, and was close enough to the women to catch some of their words. Their voices were high and excited, crowded with Friday evening, new babies, clothes and family life. Coming to a small white pub, the nondescript woman asked the chubby one if she was sure she wouldn't. The other said she really had to get going and that she'd see her on Sunday. The two laughed meaninglessly, said their goodbyes and waved stupidly into each other's face. Gilligan felt the trapped rat dashing about inside his skull, its tiny offensive claws scrabbling for freedom. He crossed back to the other side of the road where tall trees and a long stretch of hedging created sections of shade that interspersed the haloed light thrown by the street lamps, the perfect cover into which he could meld. It gave him the protection too from the rain, which, without warning, had become torrential. Although this wasn't how he'd planned it, his instinct told him that the time to strike was now. His original plan to stake out his quarry and study it from a distance, become aware of its movements and its idiosyncrasies, he could forego. Sometimes even the most experienced and cautious of hunters recognized when something was presented to them as though an offering from some unseen force. When the woman, her white jacket now held over her head, turned into the alcove between an unlit building and what might have been a fence-in park, Gilligan crossed back over to the other side of the road. He heard the sound of the car door cracking open and the clunk of it being shut. Twisting his head about, he used his ears as much as his eyes. Apart from a car approaching in the distance, nothing and nobody. And then, from where the woman and her car were hidden in the alcove, he heard the firing of an engine. Onto the shiny pavement there spilled a pool of light. The light changed from red to white reverse lights. From his trousers pocket, Gilligan took the penknife he used for cutting his pipe tobacco. With his thumbnail, he worked the blade free and held it by his side. The woman's car began to reverse slowly, but braked as the car on the road pushed by at speed. Gilligan slashed the blade across his own forearm and ran fast at the again reversing car while closing the knife. As he half vaulted, half jumped over the car's rear, he slapped his hand hard on the boot. Accustomed to tumbling safely on the ground from his rugby days, he pocketed the knife and rolled about on the pavement. The woman was out of the car, her hands to the sides of her head, and asking in a high-pitched voice if he was okay. She didn't see him, she told him, and she asked excitedly if he needed an ambulance. No, Gilligan said, it's just my arm. He took his palm away from where he had pressed it, the open wound now a black and soggy mess from his fall to the ground. Is there someone I can call? I'm okay, really, Gilligan said. I'm parked about 5 minutes up the road. He chucked his chin to indicate the direction and wiped the back of his hand across his drenched brow. He flinched exaggeratedly at the stinging sensation in his arm. He made as if to move off. The woman, her eyes dropped to his arm, her forehead a frown, told him she had something and to hang on. He watched her full figure while she leaned into the car, one knee on the driver's seat. The urge to step forward, grasp her with both hands and squeeze her swollen flesh, the way he would test the rump of a Clydesdale, he resisted. She emerged with a bottle of water and a packet of tissues. Gilligan took them, but made a deliberate mess of trying to open the bottle, as though the cut on his arm had somehow affected his grip. My hand, he said, holding the plastic bottle in the crook of his arm and fumbling to remove the cap. I can't bend my fingers, they're frozen. Let me call someone, the woman said, shaking now in the freezing rain and drawing the collar of her white coat about her neck. No, there's no need, Gilligan said. I'd best be getting on the road. Maybe he hesitated and squinted into the darkened road. You could just give us a spin as far as my car. I'm just up that a ways a bit. But your hand, the woman said. Gilligan shook his head. Not a problem. All I need is one good hand. He smiled and held out the supposedly injured one and curled and opened the fingers of the good one. The woman looked unsure, but nodded to a clenched expression. If, of course, I'm not putting you out, he said. Come on, she said. What am I thinking? It's the very least I can do. On the short drive along the country road, the woman talked relentlessly. Gilligan clenched his teeth and bobbed his head up and down without listening. He was going over the scenario he'd practiced in his head countless times, but this wasn't that scenario. That's me there, he said, as the woman's headlights lit up his jeep parked at the side of the road. Oh, she said, right. And she pulled up behind the Pajero. She flicked on the inside light. Gilligan could sense her fear now, could almost smell it, and what was flashing through her head. It broke down on me, he said. She'd been overheating this past while, but she'll be grand now. Good, she said, good. She stared straight before her, and he could see the way her fingers gripped the steering wheel. Any man that raises his hand to a woman in my books is not a man, he said. I have to get home, she said. My husband is expecting me. He'll be wondering where I am. What happened next, Gilligan experienced as though detached from his own being. He might have been seeing things through someone else's eyes. He reached over, killed the engine, and removed the keys from the ignition. As he did this, the woman sucked in her breath, leaned sideways from him, and pushed backwards into her seat. He felt her swollen front pressed against his arm, the first touch. And then his hand was about her wrist, the other over her mouth. And while he tried to pull across from the driver's seat to the passenger seat and into the dark road. He shushed her and tried to reassure her that he wouldn't hurt her. But the woman fought hard and struggled to get out her own door and alternately clung onto the steering wheel, so that Gilligan was forced to give up. Instead, he released her, and while he bustled out his side and ran around the car, she screamed into the night a long scream. That scream he muffled with his large hand when he grabbed her as she pushed herself from the car. "Take it easy now," he said, while he dragged her from the jeep. "Okay, take it easy. The baby. Think of the baby. We don't want to damage the baby." Getting a gag about her mouth proved more difficult than it looked in films, but once he got her hands and feet bound with wheel ties, he managed to double gag her. Into her mouth he put a piece of torn bed linen. This he reinforced by tying another strip about her mouth to keep it in place. With the woman safely trussed up and lying in the back seat, coat thrown over to keep her warm, Gilligan drove off. By turns he spoke to her, telling her all about his plans for the baby, or, when he couldn't think of anything worth saying, he raised the sound of Johnny Cash playing on the stereo. He sang along with the song Delia, in his own voice a new timbre, the triumphant crowing of a rooster when he first hears the cheeping coming from the incubated eggs beneath his favourite hen. Thank you.